The Sopwith Camel was considered by many to be the definitive fighter aircraft of the Allied forces during the First World War. Incredibly manoeuvrable and well armed for the time, it found itself a match for the Fokker triplanes that were causing havoc against the Allied air forces. Hello everyone, Matt from Model Minutes here, and today I'm constructing the 1/72 scale plastic model kit of the Sopwith F1 Camel from Revell. So join me in this video as I get inside the box and find out what this kit is like to build. For a more in-depth view of the contents of the box, including the sprues and decals, take a look at the unboxing video I made on that topic. Today, however, I'm focusing on the quality of the build and what it's like at the end. I'll pop a list of products I used during this build on the screen now to give you an idea of the kind of paints you might need to get. As always, please remember that building models can be hazardous at times due to the use of sharp tools and toxic paints and chemicals. Revell recommends this kit to those aged 10 years and older. With that out of the way, let's get into it. The year is 2019. The Model Minutes channel is about 3 years old and has about 3,000 subscribers. I haven't bought an airbrush yet, and I'm still using a white background for my videos. I started off this build still hand painting everything, and I think that it would be appropriate to continue that by not getting my airbrush out later on. So, my first steps back then was to carefully remove flash from various parts whilst they are still on the sprue. I used my knife to do this. I then thought it would be a good idea to paint the various wing surfaces and internal areas with a base coat of Tamiya XF59 Desert Yellow, which I thinned down with some X20A acrylic thinner. I used Humbrol 26 matte khaki acrylic, which was again thinned with Tamiya thinners on the pilot. I also used this on the external areas around the cockpit. Humbrol 61 matte flesh acrylic was carefully painted onto the face of the pilot. I then carefully snipped the fuselage halves and pilot away from the sprues. I'm using Tamiya extra thin cement here to glue the pilot into place, and then I joined the two fuselage halves and used more of this cement to flow between the gaps and bond them together. Humbrol 11 Silver was next to be used, again being thinned with a few drops of thinner. I painted this carefully onto the engine mount, taking care to avoid the areas I've already painted brown. Whilst this paint was on my brush, I used it on the moulded representation of the rotary engine inside the cowling. I used Humbrol 53 Gunmetal Grey to paint the twin machine guns whilst they are still on the sprue. I then dry brushed some of this paint into the engine to bring out some of those details. The bomb rack also received a layer of this paint. Humbrol 103 Matte Cream was now used to paint the bombs on the rack. The machine guns have now dried and they were cut from the sprue and glued into place on the nose of the model. I then cut the tail surfaces from the sprue and glued them together, before adding them to the back of the fuselage. Humbrol 30 was the dark green paint I chose to use on the upper wing surfaces, so it was again thinned and then carefully brushed onto those areas. I proceeded to also use this on the fuselage, taking care to avoid the areas I had already painted. I thought this would be a quick and simple build to complete, but it was at this point that fate would intervene. And nothing happened to this kit. It sat on a shelf, in its box, in a period of limbo, not yet meeting its destiny of being featured in a build video on my channel. Models came and models went, and it still sat there for nearly 2 years. Until finally, the box was reopened and in 2021 it would see the light of day again. A lot has changed since then, not only in the world but also my modelling skills and video style. I'm not entirely happy with the work that me from 2 years ago did, but I think it's still fitting to complete this with only brush painting. So I'm going to get a different colour of green on these parts. Vallejo Camouflage Olive Green was thinned with Tamiya X20A and then carefully used to cover up the previous layers of green paint. My painting skills have improved since 2019 and I think I can do a good job of this one. Next I used Vallejo Medium Flesh Tone, again thinned, to cover up the undersides which I thought looked a little yellow. But I think I just made it worse. Now it has a much more vibrant colour and just stood out too much. I think I can fix this though by putting a different colour on top. I chose Pale Sand for this, again thinning it and then going over the top of all these yellow areas. But now, having applied that paint and left it to dry, it was a bit blotchy and far too pale. I just can't get it right. Unless I mix the pale sand and medium flesh tone together. I used about equal parts until I had a colour that was pretty much in between both of them. Finally, a colour I was happy with. Once again, this was painted into the correct areas of the model. With that done, Humbrol 62 matte leather was used to cover up the brown around the cockpit that I painted previously. I wasn't happy with that old brown colour as it was much too dull. This leather one is a bit closer to the painting instructions. Vallejo aluminium was then carefully brushed onto the engine mount area to give a better look than the silver I used last time. Tamiya XF7 Flat Red was then thinned and brushed onto the cowling of the engine. I stuck this part on a cocktail stick so I could rotate it as I applied the colour to it. A couple of layers of this paint would be needed to get a nice uniform finish. I think this was around the time when I had run out of Tamiya Extra Thin, so instead I'm using some Humbrol Liquid Poly to glue the wheel hubs into their recesses on the wheels. It's not my favourite glue, it's a little bit more aggressive than the Extra Thin, but it'll do the job. These were then also given a few layers of the red paint. I bet you can guess where I'm going to use this Vallejo gunmetal paint. Yep, on those guns, just carefully covering up any untidy areas. I also applied the residue on my brush to the engine to dull down the shine of the silver underneath. I used some Humbrol Polycement from a tube for the next step. It's a bit thicker than the other glues I have, and I ran it along the edges of the fuselage using a cocktail stick and then joined the lower wings to the fuselage. I realised the struts on the fuselage wouldn't fit into their holes, so I removed the lower wing surface carefully to allow me access to enlarge their locating holes using a small drill bit. With that done, I'd replace the lower wing and then glue the struts into the holes I had just drilled. Humbrol 110 Natural Wood was carefully painted onto the propeller and the struts on the wings. When that paint was dry, I added cement to the slots in the upper wing and then carefully added it onto the model. This was a fiddly step, trying to get all the struts aligned at the same time. But with some patience and care, I managed to succeed. I weighted the model down to make sure that the wings would glue in place. Vallejo Matte Black can now be thinned and then carefully painted onto the tyres of the wheels. Again, I stuck them on a stick so I could rotate them as I go. I pushed the propeller into the hole in the engine part and then carefully glued the retaining pin on the back. If you're careful with your glue here, you can get the propeller to turn freely. This can now be glued into place on the model, taking care to avoid getting cement in the wrong places and spoiling that paint finish. The landing gear is a bit of another fiddly step. The legs are glued into their mounting points and then the cross brace glued between them. The wheels can then be glued onto the pegs on the landing gear. I used Vallejo gloss varnish which was thinned with water. to paint the entire model ready for the decals. This gloss layer will help protect the previous paint layers and act as a good surface for the decals to help prevent them from silvering. Speaking of the decals, they're quite well printed with some very interesting insignia, and there is enough provided to replicate just one paint scheme. I cut the sheet into more manageable sections to make it a bit easier to apply them. As usual, I popped the decals in some warm water to release them from the backing paper. I'm using Microset and Sol from Microscale as my decal softening solutions in this build. I brushed some Microset from the blue bottle onto the model, carefully apply the decal and allow it to soften down a bit. The roundels on the lower wings have separate red dots for the centres. Not a huge fan of this, but it helps if the decal printer doesn't have good registration to get them central. After adding a little Microset, the red dot is carefully placed as centrally as I can get it. There are some interesting decals on the tail, and they are pretty much the exact size of the part, which is quite good. With the decals in place, some Microsol is brushed onto the top of them to help soften them further into the plastic and details, making them look as though they've been painted on. I then left the plane to completely dry before the next step. Vallejo matte varnish was thinned with a little water. It was then brushed onto the entire model to dull down the shine of the previous layers of gloss. Although I did avoid painting the engine cowling and silver areas, as I thought that should still be quite vibrant. This paint will also help seal the decals, protecting them and ensuring that they stay in place. Humbrol 81 Pale Yellow was thinned with a drop of Tamiya thinner, then carefully painted onto the bombs. I wasn't particularly happy with the previous colour choice. The Vallejo gunmetal would make a reappearance, and I would touch up the bomb racks to make them look a little neater. With those paints dry, a little gloss varnish was applied to the bombs. The reason I did this was because I'd seen pictures online of these bombs with red stripes on them, so I'm going to use this spare decal from my Revell Lancaster to replicate this. I cut as much of the decal as I thought I would need from the sheet, then applied it in the exact same way as the other decals, making sure the excess decal wrapped around the outer bombs. When it was dry, some more matte varnish was brushed over the top to again seal it in. I then scraped some of the paint away from the lower side of the aircraft and glued the bomb rack into place. I followed the instructions for the placement of this bomb rack, but looking at some pictures of the real thing, it might be better to place it closer to the support struts of the landing gear. And with that, I'm calling my build of the Revell Sopwith F1 Camel in 1/72 scale complete. Before we get into the review of the kit though, let's hear a little about the history of the real aircraft. For this, I'd like to welcome Official Model Workshop, another modelling YouTuber. Over to you.
The Sopwith Camel was one of Britain's most successful fighter aircraft during the Great War. It was designed by the Sopwith Aviation Company. It had its first flight on December 22, 1916, although it was introduced to the battlefield in June 1917. It was a company successor to the Sopwith Pup and became one of the best known aircraft of the First World War. Although being primarily used by the Royal Flying Corps, soon to be the Royal Air Force, it was used by the Royal Naval Air Service as well, soon to be called the Fleet Air Arm. An outstanding 5,490 aircraft were built between 1917 and 1920 and was operated by no less than 14 different countries. Sadly, of the 5,490 aircraft built, only 7 originals survive today, although there are a few numbers of replicas still flying. Armed with 2 Vickers synchronized machine guns, it was a formidable plane to fly against. Being very maneuverable, it was more than a match for the Fokker triplane.
Thanks so much for that history segment. Official Model Workshop is a small but growing scale model channel who makes some interesting build and review videos. I'd also like to thank RNAS10_Oliver and his channel Simon Anonymous for the gameplay video that we saw. The Sopwith Camel we saw in that segment had a custom skin for his aircraft nicknamed Lady Elizabeth, which he designed personally. I'll add links to both their channels in the description box so you can go check them out. Anyways, where were we? Yes, let's review this model kit. So I think you'll have noticed by now there is a bit of a seam line down the centre of the aircraft. Whilst it's no surprise that a kit of this age might have seams, it's partly due to 2019 me not realising when he built it, or not really knowing what to do about it. I think that had I started this kit now, I could have potentially avoided that seam. But despite the kit tooling dating back to 1963, I didn't think it was too bad of a build. The parts were quite well moulded, with an acceptable level of detail. There was some flash in places, but on the whole it was quite manageable. The decals are printed to a good quality and applied to the model well, but I would have liked to have had the choice of paint schemes in this set, seeing as only one was provided. The instructions are generally okay as well, but, as usual, I'm not the biggest fan due to the colour callout system Revell uses, along with them being printed in black and white, which can lead to some confusion when painting your model. So, keeping those points all in mind, is it worth buying? Well, at the time of this video it would seem that the price of this kit is around the £5 mark here in the UK, which is in line with other similar products in the Revell range. But given the age of the tooling and single paint scheme offered, I feel that it might be just a little bit high of a price. Certainly if you can get it cheaper, then it would definitely be worth getting as a fun weekend build. But being the cheapskate that I am, £5 just seems a little steep for such a small model. So if you did want to go and get one of these kits, what's the likelihood? It would seem that there are some stocks floating around here and there in various online and physical model shops, but the last time this was officially released was in 2010 as part of a model set with paints and glue. The version I have here was released a year earlier in 2009, but apparently there was also a 2006 release which did feature two decal schemes, if my research is to be believed. The item number for that version is 04111, if you're lucky enough to find one. Reflecting on my skills though, I think over the last 2 years since I started this build, I could have built this to a higher standard had I started it from scratch today. But given that I was fixing the mistakes that previous me made, I'm pretty happy with the results. I managed to select some better paints compared to my previous limited choices from back then, and to be honest, the reason I have more paints now is due to the support of my patrons and channel members. A massive thanks to these guys on screen for their extra contribution to the channel. Shout out to my newest member Guy, who joins us on Patreon. Welcome to the club. But yeah, this is on the whole not a bad kit to build, and I'm pretty happy with how it looks. I'm not a massive fan of rigging biplanes, and I pretty much wanted this kit at a point that I could leave it so I could make a start on other projects. But if you'd like a future video where I focus on rigging some of the models in my collection, let me know in the comments. And with that, I think it's time to wrap this one up. In general, despite this being quite an old tooling and having a few little issues here and there, it does build up into quite an attractive little model, which shouldn't cause too many problems for a modeller who has a little bit of experience under their belt. If you're new here and would like to see more of my videos, please click that subscribe button and ring the bell so you never miss an upload. Let me know what you think of my build down in the comments, and take a look in the description box for links to my various socials and other ways you could help support the channel. Once again, thanks to the guys who contributed to this video, and finally, a massive thank you to you for watching this one, and I'll see you on the workbench again next time.